Hello, thanks for clicking on this video. I'm going to be talking about why you should get into Netrunner, and if you're going to get into Netrunner, why you should start playing, or why you should aim at playing Standard in the near future. What is Standard is maybe the first question. So Standard is the largest format that is really majorly supported by Null Signal Games, and it is composed of about 800 cards at the moment. It is a combination of cards that were produced by Fantasy Flight Games and the current producers of Netrunner, which is Null Signal Games. Both of these two companies did something that was called cycles, so they would release a group of about 120 to 130 cards as split up into kind of multiple sub-products, but they all kind of went together. For FFG, there were 3 products, 2 cycles and 1 product, the Red Sand Cycle, Katara Cycle, Rand Reverie. And for Null Signal Games, they have System Gateway, System Update, Ashes Cycle, Borealis Cycle, and the Liberation Cycle, of which we have the first of 2 parts currently released. So Standard is all of these cards combined, and you can use any cards in this format, except ones that are on the ban list. So Standard is, these 800 cards, and you can combine them to make a Corp deck and a Runner deck and get started playing Netrunner. And I think Standard has a lot of upsides and things that make it really appealing. So what are those things? Well, Netrunner at its core is one of the most exciting games, or like most enticing games that I've had a chance to play. It has a high amount of both personal skill expression as well as kind of deck building expression. Netrunner decks, because you build 2 of them, and they're not, dude bashery things, they're all about controlling probabilities and conditional events and making reactive choices to the board state and the way that resources accumulate. Netrunner is just a different beast from almost every other card game out there. And the cool thing about Standard is it has the greatest breadth of strategies of any format of Netrunner at the moment. Both Startup and Eternal, the other 2 main formats of Netrunner that you'll find people playing in person, well, maybe not so many people play Eternal in person, they tend to have really strong, clear, strongest decks. But Standard at the moment has a lot of variety and not really a clear best deck. And there are decks that say, oh, this thing is really strong, and this deck that functions on an entirely different axis is also really strong. Other things to go about that are really good about Standard, and a reason I would recommend people, if they're interested in getting to Netrunner, that they should try to make the jump into Standard once they understand the basics of the game, is that it has the largest player base, and that means that they have a lot of deep knowledge about the game and have gotten really good at teaching people and bringing them up to speed. Netrunner has an extremely nice community, an extremely welcoming and friendly community to a lot of different types of players with different walks of life. And I think Standard is no exception to that, and a great way to meet a lot of people who are just excited to have more people to talk about the best card game ever with. I will also say most Netrunner content, my own and a lot of the other creators in the scene, focus on Standard. And a big part of that is also because the tournament scene is focused on Standard. This is just the way of the beast. It's as far as I can tell, the main design goal of the designers when they're balancing sets. So all of this kind of leads to Standard being, I think, the richest experience you can get with Standard. The next 2 things are a little bit like my opinions, and you won't have to, everything has been my opinions, but these are a little bit, iffier. From my perspective, learning a new card game is kind of the same process, regardless of what format you go into. No format is expecting you to know every single card in the format, because a lot of cards don't see any play. And so the difference of learning one format versus another is just which pool of cards and which most popular cards in each of those you'll have to memorize first or learn first. And it's basically the same task either way. And so if I'm choosing between 2 things and it's like, oh, well, the total card pool is smaller in this format, but the effective card pool is pretty close in size, I'd rather pick the format that gives me the most kind of strategic and diversity of play. So that's kind of my pitch for why you should just take the dive into Standard rather than playing Startup. Another thing I should say is proxies are legal for all events at all levels of play. We had, and I'll talk about it later, the third place person at Worlds last year was playing a deck that was almost entirely proxies, which I thought was incredibly cool. So I've said that you should get into Standard. How would I actually recommend going about doing it? The first thing I would do is I would pick a faction you like, or really two factions you like, a runner faction and a corp faction. Every faction is more or less viable in Standard at the moment. Almost every corp faction won one of the largest events of the first half of this year, and runners have been really close neck and neck across the factions throughout in terms of people's assessment of their power level. So you're not handicapping yourself by picking a faction because you like it for any reason. Could be you like the color, could be you like a specific card you saw, could be a friend told you this faction is the best. Any of those could be good reasons to pick it. Once you've picked a runner faction and a corp faction, I would net deck a deck from a recent tournament. So in the description, I have links to NetrunnerDB and Always Be Running. NetrunnerDB is the most popular deck repository for people that are publishing Netrunner decks, and Always Be Running is a tournament repository where you can see people link the decks they've used to claim and get top spots in events. So it's a great place to get decks. I'm also going to, in just a minute or two, walk through some decks I would recommend so that you can get some diversity and experience of the Standard experience. But I know for some of you, you don't want to net deck. You want to start building with a deck you built yourself. So if you're going to do that, here's how I would advise going about doing it. I would build your deck from Gateway and Update, and then pick one or two null signal game sets, and just look at the cards in that faction for your deck. That actually is a pretty small number of cards. It's less than 15 cards that you would get from each kind of null signal games set. Or maybe less than 20, I should say. So that's a pretty manageable number of cards that you're actually looking at deck building with. And so that's a great way to start learning. And then what you should do is once you've played a couple of games with those decks, somewhere between 3 and 10, rotate off to a new faction. Do a new net deck or build your own decks from the Gateway Update and then a couple of null signal packs. And just try and get a sense for what feels fun. How do you what are you learning? Is there a faction that's really speaking to you or a combination of cards that's really exciting? And once you found that, then you can kind of really drill down, and that's when I would definitely recommend going to NetrunnerDB and seeing what other people have published so you can figure out what cards they're grabbing in so that you don't have to try and learn the entire card pool. You can just learn the cards that people are putting in decks that are kind of like the one you're trying to build. You're not going to know all of the cards in your opponent's decks. That's okay. For the most part, you can adapt to those on the fly. And I think that's one of the coolest parts of Netrunner is you can be extremely reactive to the board state of your opponent, and you have a lot of agency about how you do react to those things. The other thing I should say is, once again, print proxies for cards you don't own. Don't feel like you have to go and chase Fantasy Flight cards. Don't even feel like you have to buy all of the Null Signal or any of the Null Signal Games cards. You can proxy everything. Okay, so I've said that you should net deck. Let me give you some decks that you could maybe start out with. These are not necessarily the best decks in these factions, but I think they show you a lot of what you can get out of Standard. This deck is Hasbiroid Precision Design. That's the identity. It's basically also the name of the deck because it's really been the only... This style of Precision Design deck has been kind of the quintessential archetype for this deck, this identity, since it was released. And this is just trying to score agendas behind ice. Now, if you look at this, the only cards here that are from Fantasy Flight Games are the Ikawa Project, the Rashida Jaheim, and the Gatekeeper. Everything else is a Null Signal Games card. So just to give you some sense of what that distribution looks like. I would say the only card you would actually need, and I'll talk about this card later, is Rashida Jaheim. But this is kind of a pretty typical HB game plan, where it's just trying to do things efficiently and well. And BN plays very differently. Their deck is all about tags. Almost every card in this deck interacts with tags in some way. And so it's trying to, get the runner in a real hole by hitting them with lots and lots of tags. I think this one's a lot of fun and is very different from the other decks in this list. It is a much more asset-based game plan, as you can see by the 18 assets. And this is one of those strategies that I think is less well supported in Startup, but is something that's really strong and interesting in Standard. Next up, we got Ag Infusion. This is our Jinteki deck, and Ag Infusion is, one of these transformative identities, and identities tend to be the cards that are kind of the most transformative, and there's a little bit more representation of Fantasy Flight identities than there are of other cards that Fantasy Flight produced, because Ag Infusion has this really interesting ability to warp where the runner is running by trashing ice that's unrezzed on the server they're running, which is quite cool. But this is kind of a different take. Instead of the Precision Design Glacier deck, this is kind of Jinteki's take on Glacier. There are other styles of Jinteki deck out there, but this is the one I would maybe recommend getting started with. It's a little bit more aggressive, and it has some kind of kill plans in it, which I think make it a nice different flavor from the other decks that we're talking about. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the outfit. This deck is yet another different style of Corp deck. So I think this is shows how wide Standard can be. We've got 4 different archetypes, and there's even more outside of this that I'll talk about kind of at the end of the video. This deck is trying to fast advance its agenda, so it's trying to score them from hand without giving the runner a whole turn to steal them off the board. It can and often does score a few agendas behind a couple of their ice, but the goal is to kind of go very quickly, accumulate bad publicity, and use that to score regulatory captures from hand very effectively. So these are the corps I would recommend if you want a net deck. These are some really good ones to start, and you can just take these right off the video, sleeve them up, and start playing. For runner side, we've got, once again, a deck for each faction. So this is Hoshiko. This is more or less the kind of quintessential runner and maybe the strongest runner of the format. However, I missed that this list has a currently banned card in it. DreamNet is not currently legal for Standard play. You can replace the DreamNet with Earthrise Hotels, which you can see on screen here. But this list actually is not packing a lot of win conditions. I guess it's packing both Wake and Plant and Twinning. And the goal is just to kind of try and slow down the corporation, deny their ability to score with some really good breakers and kind of off-breaker tools. And you can see some really cool aspects of Anarch where you're both blowing up their ice with cards like Hippo and then doing kind of somewhat self-destructive things with cards like Bankar and Raindrops Cut Stone. So this is a very Anarch-feeling deck, which I think is really fun. We have a deck, Sable, which has kind of the same win conditions in Wake and Plant and Twinning, but is going to feel very different to play, much more criminal and kind of aggressive in playstyle. This is probably the deck, if you're new to Netrunner, that I would recommend starting with, not because it's an easy deck to play and there's maybe some changes you'd want to make. You'll also need to drop the 1 DreamNet from this, probably once again for an Earthrise Hotel. And in fact, it's a better card. It's probably just a better swap here regardless. But this deck is going to encourage you to make lots of runs. I think that's the reason I would recommend this to a new player. You're kind of being coaxed to make a run a turn, and you've got lots of cards that synergize with you running often and effectively. So I think this is a great deck to start with. Arasana, I'm a huge fan of Arasana. The decks I'm playing are a little bit different from this one, but this is a pretty good starting foundation point for Arasana, and has some tricks and some just kind of basically quite strong fundamentals. This is probably a little bit higher on the complexity side. It's got actually quite a lot of moving pieces, but if that's your jam, this is a really fun way to start playing it. So I've given you some starting decks. I now want to make sure you're equipped with knowing some of the basic power cards for every faction. This isn't going to be an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that you're going to see a lot of, so I want to make sure you're aware of them. For HB, we've got Seamless Launch, Managarm Skunk Works, and Biotic Labor. All of these directly help with scoring because HB is a lot about just scoring your agendas. Seamless Launch is more powerful than it looks on paper, and Managarm Skunk Works is a great defensive upgrade. Biotic Labor is one of those fast advanced tools that allows the corporation using it to score agendas without the runner ever having an opportunity to steal it off the board. For Jinteki, I've grabbed a bunch of their net damage cards. I haven't shown a lot of net damage stuff. There's a whole net damage based archetype that you can start playing with. If you're going to do that, I would look at the personal evolution identity. Snare and Sting are both very important to these sort of damage and trap style decks, and Analytic Void is a pretty strong staple in these kind of glacier-y game plans. And these are cards you will probably see quite a bit. For NBN, I've already talked about it. They are a faction that loves to tag the runner. Ping is basically everywhere. Yes, it's a gateway card, and yes, it is more or less one of the power staples you'll be playing around a lot. Oppo Research is a brand new card from No Signal Games in the most recent set, and it is very powerful as well, and it's a way for them to protect their assets and agendas, because their ice, like Ping, is often a little flimsy, but if you can, punish the runner for floating a lot of tags or give them lots of tags, it is to the corp's advantage. And Bologna is one of those ways they leverage that advantage. If they can keep the runner poor, battling them on tags, then they can score this Bologna without a lot of risk of it being stolen. For Wayland, Wayland is kind of typified by a couple of effects, and I've kind of grabbed the card to represent the effect more so than the card itself. So End of the Line is a kill card. It says it could do 4 meat damage, and if you could do more damage than the runner has cards in hand, they are flatlined. And so End of the Line is a combat, they usually splash tags from NBN, or NBN will splash End of the Lines into their decks to land kills. Stavka is a kind of destroyer, and Wayland have historically had the best destroyers. And then we get to Project Atlas, which is one of these powerful tutoring cards. And Wayland tends to have better access to tutoring than other factions do. And Atlas is in particular a power card. In most Wayland decks that are trying to score are going to be playing 3 copies of Atlas. On runner side, for Anarch, we have Hippo, Stargate, and Paladin. Hippo and Stargate are both kind of quintessential trashing and breaking cards. I could maybe have also included Bankar, which I talked about briefly earlier. And then Paladin is one of these economic backbones of the format at the moment. For Criminal, a lot of Criminal's power is in prolonging the early game. So Hermes, which bounces wastes the corpse time, forcing them to reinstall key cards. Amakua, which lets them turn early runs in unprotected servers into a very strong icebreaker. And Diversion of Funds, which allows them to reset the economic clock and maybe swing it in their favor, are all really powerful and core Criminal tools. Shaper has been defined basically for its entire lifetime by self-modifying code. Self-modifying code allows the Shaper player to go and get their icebreaker just in time for when they're encountering a piece of ice. And Simulchip allows them to recur programs from the heap. So these two combined give Shapers an unparalleled access to the programs in their deck, which means that they're really good at handling ice. And then Conduit is the reward for doing so. If they can set up a way to run R&D very cheaply again and again and again, Conduit is often enough to just carry them off to a win. So these are kind of the power cards in all of the factions. Yes, there's a few more, but these are the ones that you can kind of anchor your thinking about, and a lot of the factions is going to be based around that. In terms of cards, you'll note almost all the cards I've shown you are from Null Signal Games, or as it was called originally, Nisei. So in terms of cards from Fantasy Flight, I actually think there's basically only 3 cards you actually need to know. NG Overrun goes in a lot of decks that are trying to score because it can serve as a really good bluff that has strict upside for the Corp. Rashida Jaheim goes in basically every Corp deck. This card is actually, I think, the most popular Corp card across all decks at major events this year. More popular than a card like Hedge Fund, which comes in System Gateway and seems like you'd want to put it in every deck. And then Border Control is one of these really interesting format-defining pieces of ice that ends the run as a paid ability, so after the runner, during a run on the server. This allows it to both force the runner to get a barrier breaker and still give the corporation agency to end the run, once per game when they want to do so. I think if you know these 3 cards, you can start learning the rest of the Fantasy Flight cards at your kind of leisure as they go in decks as you see them in other people's decks or see them across the table. But these are kind of the core ones you will have to worry about. So I know I've just info dumped at you very heavily for 20 minutes. I'm going to just show you a couple of different archetypes that are all popular in the meta right now. I kind of tried to bold cards that are from Null Signal Games and italicize cards that are from Fantasy Flight, so you can kind of use that as a bit of a shortcut if this is helpful. You'll know, I mean, in Corpse, it's a little bit of a mix, but it's most of the Fantasy Flight cards that you really need to care about are actually the identities in Ossa Group, Sports Mill, Ag Infusion, and Outfit, most of which we've already talked about, and only a smattering of other cards that are particularly important. And there's really not many gotchas anymore. All of the cards that are important if I'm thinking as the runner, the corporation will res the card and I'll have time to react to it. When we get over to the runner side, interestingly, it's basically almost entirely Null Signal Games cards, which is part of why I think it's so good to get into Standard right now. You can learn a subset of the card pool and be in a really good spot for both playing runner and as playing corp. And so with that said, thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe. I also want to shout out 3 kind of very prolific content creators right now. The Metropole Grid does YouTube and Twitch streams, but I've linked his YouTube channel below. Neon Static, they do a YouTube, they're trying to do more YouTube stuff, including a lot of commentary of Standard matches. I've guested on a few of those. And they also do a podcast that really is geared at new players, so I would definitely recommend checking out. And I would also recommend checking out Queering the Message. This is a podcast done by a wonderful group of queer podcasters talking about their experience with Netrunner. And I think it's just been a lovely addition to the scene, giving a large part of the community a voice in a way it hasn't had somewhat in some previous times. So yeah, thank you for watching. I hope you like this. My next video is actually going to be a deep card and archetype deep dive analysis. So if that's really what you wanted, stay tuned. I'm hoping to have that out before Worlds, which is in about 2 weeks from the time of this video release. But yeah, thank you for watching, like and subscribe, and I hope to see you across the table for me at a Standard event in the near future. Bye.